Here today, I guess, is to just kind of provide some broad overview, some observations with respect to mule deer harvest management and strategies. I guess I was kind of disappointed when Commissioner McNitch said everyone was here for the bears. I had assumed up to that point they were here to see me.
All right, I'll concede. There's
all right,
a couple.
Okay. So there's a lot more probably observation than recommendation or suggestion in here, but it's certainly some food for thought. It's kind of a long-term trend in what we've done or where we've the direction that we've been heading in management, and the results or lack thereof with some of those management strategies. So first off, you know, there's some dilemmas troubling us. A lot of those dilemmas we'll discuss, go into a little bit. Then we'll look at buck harvest in Nevada, historic trends of buck harvest, some of the philosophies and ideas surrounding our buck harvest trends, and then doe harvest as well. So first off, looking at some of our dilemmas, some of our management dilemmas. The one thing that I just like to throw out there is who are we? When I say we, I don't necessarily mean we, the faceless bureaucratic agency that some people see NDOW as. NDOW is comprised of individuals. They're people who have passions to manage wildlife, to protect wildlife. We're comprised, the agency is comprised of individuals that share our constituents' passions for wildlife. So you know, I guess I get a little sensitive and take exception to some of the characterizations of this faceless government entity doing these things with greater cause. It's comprised of individuals, and we have a similar interest in the resource and managing that resource. Supply and demand. When we look at mule deer in Nevada, although mule deer are the most numerous species, big game species that we have in Nevada, numbering currently at approximately 109, 110,000, Nevada has approximately 1/3 the mule deer resource that neighboring Utah possesses. Nevada is the driest state in the Union. Colorado, Idaho have 5 times the number of mule deer that we have in Nevada. So that creates some dilemmas in terms of supply and demand. Revenue-based management. I continually read conspiracy theories about state agencies that are generating tag quotas and recommendations with the sole purpose of creating revenue for those agencies to exist. And in 15 years in this agency, I have never heard of any revenue discussion in conjunction with the quota setting process, the modeling process. And again, that goes back to who we are as individuals and who makes up the agency. We're individuals that first and foremost care about the resource, and by no means do we ever put revenue in front of the resource. Conservatism times conservatism, and this is really a huge dilemma for us. And basically, there's a process that biologists undertake to generate the quotas and those quota recommendations. And I'd just like to kind of just roughly outline that process and discuss the number of steps where that conservatism is introduced into that process. First of all, there's a survey conducted. The majority of those surveys are conducted aerially via helicopter. In most areas, we try to survey them twice a year. We do a fall survey in which we gather a sample size of that population, and that sample is classified according to age and gender. We express it as a ratio of fawns per 100 does, and then we also classify bucks and express that as bucks per 100 does, and then we take a step further, we classify our bucks by point class. As a biologist in the helicopter, when you're doing those classifications, if there's any question as to whether that buck might be a 4-point or is it a 3-point, the biologist errs on the side of being conservative, calling it a 3-point. If there's a question, well, is it a yearling or is it a fawn, the biologist is conservative in calling it a yearling rather than the fawn. The last thing you would want to do as a biologist, you care for your resource, is overestimate your production, your recruitment, overestimate the availability of mature animals. So there is an inherent conservatism in the survey classification process. You take the data from the surveys and you incorporate it into a population model. There's an opportunity for biologists to exercise yet further conservatism through that modeling process. There are values in that model that relate to a wounding loss that increases the estimate of buck take from the previous year. In the event that a biologist sees that buck ratio increasing, whether subconscious or otherwise, many biologists are concerned about social perceptions, going to county advisory boards, making recommendations that could be politically unfavorable with guides or outfitters or sportsmen in general. And so given the chance, they'll err on the side of conservatism through the modeling process. From the survey and the model, ultimately comes a recommendation for the quota. Once again, out of concern, I mean, you have biologists residing in small rural communities around the state. They're known in those communities, whether their kids are going to school with guides and outfitters kids, with county advisory board members kids. There is a desire to be accepted in your communities, and if you know that your recommendation wouldn't be acceptable or would cause some grief, again, there's an opportunity to exercise more conservatism. Then the county advisory board process. Through the county advisory board process, oftentimes there's some discourse between the biologist making the recommendation and the county advisory board members. In many instances, the counties support the department's recommendations, but most often, if there is a change, it's towards a more conservative recommendation. And then ultimately it comes before this commission, who takes the county advisory board input, public input, department input, and in some instances approves those recommendations, and in other instances, as we saw last year with respect to mule deer, we saw significant reductions across the board. So we have several places throughout this process where conservatism is being introduced. So we have this conservatism, so we don't have a lot of opportunity, thus the bonus point system. So as we look at Nevada's bonus point system, again, this is going back to supply and demand. We obviously have more demand than we have supply, so we had to come up with a system that allowed for a fair and equitable distribution of the tags. Isn't always fair, isn't always equitable, but one of the pluses is that anyone can draw. You have a 13-year-old kid who, with one bonus point, drew one of the most coveted tags in the state several years ago, and then you have some individuals who may have been in the draw process for 20-plus years and has been unable to get a bull elk tag, for example. Bottom line is this conservatism that we continually see through these processes equals fewer tags. With fewer tags, you have less frequent hunting opportunity. And I think any sportsman who spends time applying for tags is familiar with this phenomenon. With less frequent hunting opportunity, you have an increased expectation. If you're out of the draw, if you haven't hunted deer for 3 or 4 years, you spend a lot of time as an individual thinking about that experience and when it finally arrives, and that builds your expectation. And I like to say, never underestimate the role of expectation on perception. So with that increased expectation, there's actually a decreased likelihood of meeting that expectation. When you have that failure to meet the expectation, you introduce further conservatism. And that increased conservatism equals fewer tags. And this is just a positive feedback loop. And we're going to go back and look at some data specific to Nevada, where we've been over the last 30, 40, in some cases 50 years, and see how our management strategies have been affected by this, and if we have been able to achieve the desired result from some of these ideas. Some of the justifications being provided to promote this conservatism, and these aren't justifications coming from the department, mind you. These are justifications that we hear from some of the constituents. There aren't any deer. There are no deer. Therefore, we must reduce mortality on the deer to increase the herd size. I'd just like to point out that we're talking about largely buck-only harvest. No bucks. There's no bucks out there. Therefore, if we reduce the buck mortality by reducing tags, it will have more bucks. And lastly, one of the justifications that we hear from some of our constituents is there's no big bucks. Therefore, by allowing bucks to live longer, they'll grow bigger. And this is all predicated on the assumption that age is the primary limiting factor on antler size. So if we look at harvest as a source of mortality, in 1998, and just back up and set the stage a little bit, Nevada experienced a 100-year winter event in the winter of 92-93 where we had significant losses of mule deer. And now we can look back at that and we can realize that we overestimated the ability of our populations to recover in subsequent years. In 1998, we harvested approximately 10% of our statewide population estimate. We didn't meet our expectation and introduced more conservatism, and the years following we got more and more conservative with respect to the percentage of our population estimate that we were harvesting. And that long-term trend, can you guys see that all right? Long-term trend is negative, and there's a red diamond right here that represents last year. And we're harvesting a smaller and smaller percentage of our statewide population estimate. But at the same time, we're seeing an increase in our postseason buck ratio. So this goes back to 1983. And so the general trend in buck ratios is up. But yet you're taking a smaller and smaller percentage of your population. So if you look at the actual result of this, there's a higher and higher percentage of your population that's comprised of bucks. And so rather than expressing this buck harvest as a percent of the statewide estimate, if you actually look at it as a percent of bucks available, you've seen almost a cut in half from what was approximately 50% of the available bucks harvested. Don't pay any attention to this scale. Approximately 50% down to about 25%. That's buck harvest. Is there some way we can kill this light and put? So this red line is buck harvest as a percent of the bucks in the population. So we've taken a smaller and smaller percentage. And everybody likes to talk about the 80s. It's 85, about the mid-80s. And we were taking a significant percentage of the bucks. So if we look at 2011 buck harvest alone, we harvested 5,481 bucks statewide. That's across all hunts, resident and non-resident. That's 5% of the statewide population estimate. That's the second lowest number of bucks ever harvested. The only year that Nevada harvested fewer bucks was 1975, which was the first year of the draw. We had a population estimate that year, published population estimate of 81,000, and we harvested 500 fewer bucks, about 4,900 bucks that year. So percentage-wise, it was still a much higher percentage than what we did in 2011. However, 2011 was the lowest percent of the population estimate harvested, I say ever, but you know, since we've been keeping track of this stuff, certainly since, you know, any time before, or at least up to the 50s. So with buck ratios 50% higher in 2011 than the 1980s, this diminishes the percentage of the bucks harvested even further, which we just talked about a little bit. In 1988, we harvested 49% of the available bucks and maintained point class in the harvest and hunter success. In 2011, only 26. So we roughly cut our buck harvest when expressed as a percentage of bucks available in half. Looking at point class distribution from the harvest data throughout the 80s, we had hunter success about 37%, I believe, in 1988 compared to 42% this year. 5 percentage point difference. However, even with that 5 percentage point difference in hunter success, we were only 1 percentage point different in the percent 4-point or better in the harvest. So when we talk about buck ratios, and as biologists we throw the term around loosely, and we talk about buck ratios is simply the number of bucks expressed as a number that's relative to the number of does. So for a buck ratio of 33, it simply means that out of 133 adults, 33 of them, or approximately 25%, are bucks. Some buck ratios may go higher, but most unhunted mule deer populations will see buck ratios begin to plateau in the 60s. Somewhere in the 60s, mid-60s, it's believed that most unhunted populations, there's some kind of a biological limit, competition through bucks, immigration, for whatever reason, they tend to plateau at about in the 60s. Biologically, no lower limit has been detected in wild populations. Fewer than 5 bucks per 100 does has been adequate for insemination of 100% of the does. During the 1980s, Nevada was able to continually harvest between 43 and 49% of the available bucks while maintaining a high percentage of 4-point and better in the harvest, and have 2 of the highest number of record book heads entered into the Nevada record book in 1983 and 1986. Nevada's buck ratios as a statewide average are much higher than most other states. Through much debate, Utah recently decided to increase their statewide post-hunt buck ratios from 15 to 18, roughly half of Nevada's. Recent data from both Nevada and Colorado are suggesting that in areas with limited winter range, high buck ratios are resulting in significant competition with fawns and potentially reducing recruitment. If we look at our statewide postseason observed buck ratios, again, the general trend is positive from 1983 to 2009, with actually 3 of the highest years ever being observed in 06, 07, and I believe 09. Maybe I guess it's 08 since they're all next to each other on the graph. At the same time, if we look at our statewide fawn to doe ratios, we have a negative trend. This is statewide data, and if you break this out by unit, some units exhibit it more strongly than others. Just as kind of an anecdotal observation, those units that do have limited winter range tend to exhibit it more strongly than those that might be limited by summer range. So just a quick take-home message regarding buck harvest strategies. Restrictive buck harvest does not increase the population size, and referring specifically to 06, 07, and 08, where we had 3 of the highest post-hunt buck ratios ever observed, and we didn't see an increase in population size as a result of those restrictive buck harvests. Highest observed statewide buck ratios on record, 06, 07, 08 at 32, 31, 31, and no indication of improved quantity or improved quality exists. And again, buck ratios from 1982 to 1992 averaged 24. So buck harvest, when expressed as a percentage of the total buck population throughout the 1990s, was approximately twice what it was in 2011, and despite the seemingly aggressive harvest, both hunter success and point class of the harvest were maintained at levels very similar to what we see today at approximately 1/2 the harvest. And that's one thing that we continually hear concerns expressed by some of our constituents about being, we're going to kill all the big bucks. And the first place that we would see evidence of that is either through point class, the distribution of harvest according to point class, and hunter success. And we see no indication of that at levels that were twice what we experienced in the 80s. So that's probably the key metric that we use as biologists to begin to determine if there are some harvest effects on these populations. So we have an increasingly restrictive buck harvest, bottom line. We also see an increasingly restrictive doe harvest. It's counterintuitive to most people. I guess I suggest it's kind of an issue of scale. It's an individual versus a population. You can focus on an individual animal, and you can say, well, if I save this individual, certainly the population is going to grow. And when you consider that individual and its relationship to the habitat in which it resides, and you take a 30,000-foot view, you take a big step back and you look at the population and the health of that population, saving more individuals doesn't necessarily equate to an increase in the population. And we'll show you some data and expound on that in a little bit. Another, I guess, kind of a perspective issue is we look at absolute numbers. I think it's kind of a uniquely humanistic approach in that when we talk about populations, we always talk about number of people. 2.1 people live here. It's a city of 2 million. with deer, we have to realize that there's an animal that has, you know, a very short generation time, incredibly high productive capacity, and we're talking about the absolute numbers of deer rather than production. And if we start to look at production and recruitment in these populations, we can understand that fewer does can make more deer. And oftentimes when we talk about doe hunts, we hear animal husbandry examples, and people say, well, that's, you know, that's like telling a rancher you're going to increase his herd and you're going to kill his cows. But bottom line is, if those cows are limited on food and you have 100 cows that are only producing 25 calves, by cutting that population in half down to 50, where now you have enough hay for all of them, you can have 50 calves. So half the number, you know, to build on that same animal husbandry example, half the number of cows could produce twice as many calves. And bottom line, again, to build on that animal husbandry, it's not about your herd size. It's about your calf crop. It's about the health of those animals. It's about the weight. It's about how many you can produce. And you know, you can brag to your neighbors about your herd size, but if you're not taking anything to the market, that's not going to help you out much. An interesting finding that has just recently come out is that bucks born to undernourished does will never possess the ability to be this coveted 30-inch mule deer. And not only will those bucks not possess that ability, but it takes 2 generations removed from those animals to overcome the deficit of being born to an undernourished doe, somewhat analogous to premature infants, where they may have some deficits that are lasting. And this is a relatively new finding, and has some implications with some of our harvest strategies that I'll discuss in a minute. So if you have a small buck perhaps born to a malnourished doe or an undernourished doe, then our hunters may see a lot of small bucks in the field, and that too many small bucks kind of promotes the let them live another year mentality and contributes to the problem rather than diminishing it, which adds more conservatism, which increases the expectation, which increases or decreases the likelihood of meeting that expectation. So take-home message regarding antlerless harvest strategies, really, one of the most confusing concepts in population management is that fewer deer can produce more fawns. It's really, you know, really need to think of it in terms of throughput and production. One study that I provided the commission last year showed the average dressed weights increased by 20 pounds over 7 years in response to a sustained doe hunt. During this same time period, trophy buck harvest doubled, which is pretty similar to what we experienced in the 80s. Although we had a lot more deer at that time, which makes those things more palatable. Another study showed doe harvest resulted in higher buck harvest and improved buck quality. So with respect to the department's mule deer quota recommendations this year, we have a limited doe harvest in just 3 areas. 3 areas were approved by the commission for antlerless quotas at our meeting in February. 2 of those 3 areas were devastated by wildfire over the summer. And I'd like to point out that, that those doe harvests in those areas are critical not only to protect the remaining deer in those areas, but to protect the investment in the revegetation in those areas. We're working with our federal partners in reestablishing beneficial vegetation out there. It'll benefit not only mule deer, sage grouse, livestock. It helps all the users of the public land. Also, there's an economic investment in that re-veg work, and it's incumbent upon us to try to protect that and ensure its success. Extremely conservative buck harvest quotas with postseason buck ratio objectives in the 30s and above in most areas, again compared to 23 to 24 through the mid-1980s. I'd like to just touch on our mule deer survivability study that's ongoing, just kind of bring you up to speed a little bit, and some of the implications of our findings perhaps on some of our quota recommendations. Over the last 2 years, approximately 550 deer have been collared in 4 different areas around the state. Those 4 areas include the Rubies in Area 10, the Simpson Parks in Area 15, the Jacksons in Area 035, and up and down the Carson Front from Jacks Valley Wildlife Management Area up to Reno. All the deer that have been collared have been handled to a certain extent in that weights and measurements have been obtained. A number of samples, including blood, hair, and feces, have also been collected. And there's a great deal of information being gleaned from this effort. I'd like to speak to just a little bit of it. With respect to the body weight and the body condition indices, we've been ultrasounding these animals to determine not only pregnancy but also body fat. There's some standard methodology employed by other wildlife agencies to derive a body condition score. And one of the, I guess some of the interesting findings are that last year we had pretty similar body weights between most of our does. In the rubies, approximately 120 pounds. Simpson Parks, approximately 120 pounds. But yet we had a couple deer over in Humboldt County that were living in close association with alfalfa that tipped the scale over 170 pounds. The capture crew that just came from Colorado and had captured 1,400 deer in Colorado and have captured deer literally all around the world said they'd never seen does that size. I suggest that you know, when we see that big of a difference percentage-wise in weight, in body weight, that is at least in part an indication that, you know, deer weighing 120 pounds could be a lot bigger given ample food and nourishment. This year, we saw an entirely different pattern in our body weights. The ruby, the deer were much heavier this year at 150, 160 pounds. Carson range was pretty similar, similar in Humboldt County. However, the Simpson Parks were down considerably, 115 pounds. They were actually down below last year. And I guess some of the reasons that this may be the case, the Simpson Parks are located in Area 15, which is 151 through 155 in Lander County. And in 1999, there was approximately 200,000 acres in that area that burned. There was one fire in particular in the Simpson Parks that burned approximately 80,000 acres. So that's 13 years ago now. And over the last 6 years, we've seen some pretty significant increases in the population estimate, going from approximately 2,800 to almost 3,500. We don't have this year's population estimate in yet. Also, as we look at the buck ratio in this area, we went from about 25 up to almost 40. So we have a population that appears to be responding to perhaps the disturbance that this fire caused in 1999. Well, this year is the driest fall on record in Lander County, going back to 1891. This population, you know, as we see here, is increasing significantly. We see increases in the buck ratio as well. At some point, with that population increasing, and then coming into extremely dry year, that's going to affect that carrying capacity, and that's going to be coming down. It's quite possible that this population won't continue this growth, certainly given the conditions that we have out there now. And we were unable to even ultrasound these does because their body condition was so poor. They were emaciated by the end of January. This was one area that we recommended for an antlerless harvest prior to handling these animals and getting this data, and it was a recommendation that was not accepted. These are animals that we can't stockpile. We can't predict what Mother Nature is going to bring, but we certainly can't stockpile them. So with that, I'd like to just open up if you have any questions pertaining to those, either the mule deer survivability study or the buck harvest strategies or doe harvest strategies.
Mr. Drew.
Ben, I don't think this is a question, more two statements. And one, I appreciate the presentation, Tony, but I really appreciate what you started out with in terms of who the Department of Wildlife is. And it's made up of a lot of very dedicated people whose hearts and souls are in the right place. and I've had the privilege to work with a lot of you folks over the years, and I think that's something that goes underestimated and understated. So I appreciate what you guys do. People don't understand what you do, where your hearts are, nor do they understand the risk involved in this business. It's one of the riskiest businesses there is out there. So to all the department employees, I really appreciate everything you do. And of course, we wouldn't be able to do our jobs without you. With that being said, and in terms of what happened with the quotas last year, if you look up on this commission, you'll see a lot of new faces. And I can promise you this, at least one of those new faces, and I probably can speak for 3 or 4 of the others, do business a little bit different than what happened last year. So I just want that message to get back to your folks.
Thank you.
You also have some old faces that spent 4 hours supporting your position last year, too.
And that was not a slight at the chairman.
Any other commissioners with a comment? So this is timely. Next commission meeting we have quota setting, and so I would imagine that we're going to see some quotas that are going to maybe reflect what we just saw in the presentation, and it'll be interesting. We'll have some good discussions with our county advisory boards and everybody else, and it'll be interesting to see how everybody comes out on it. But anyway, thank you very much, and I like the idea of presentation, and before you just come to a commission meeting and and try to explain it there. Having done it at this meeting makes a lot of sense to me. So anyway, thanks. Anybody else? Commissioner Rain.
Just basically a question on the support material for this. You send that out to the commission. I didn't see that sent out prior to this meeting. Could you email that to everybody? Appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, and our standard practice is that on informational items we don't give out. We don't require that informational item be distributed before, and so but we do appreciate if you give it to us after the fact, and of course this is really relevant for next meeting, and so it is definitely before that point. So thanks.
You bet.
Any other commissioners with a comment? Okay, thank you very much, guys. Appreciate it.
Mike has.
Mike, go ahead.
Part two.
Part two. Okay.
There's more. Hang on. All right, for the record, Mike Cox, big game staff biologist for Nevada Department of Wildlife. Tony is our focused staff biologist with mule deer. I take kind of the rest of them. And so I'm going to lead in a similar but slightly angled direction that Tony was working in, but I will be focusing on female ungulate management, harvest and removal with other species, elk, pronghorn, bighorn, and some, I think some interesting data that we've been collecting over the years that unless we do a workshop like this, there's typically not time to share this with you. So hopefully you'll appreciate it. A couple important things that come into play when you look at managing the female portion of an ungulate herd, that they're the baby makers, is not every animal is going to survive. Old age or mid-age, that's the way life is out in the wild. And I think some people forget about that concept. And it's going to come into play later in some slides and some graphs. Another big component to managing the female component of these herds is carrying capacity. There's a lot of different variables that go into play, the resources that make up these habitats. Most of us have been taught it's basically food, water, and shelter, but there's a lot of issues in terms of the distribution of those resources and the timing of those resources seasonally. We have female harvest management going on right now, and we've had for a long, long time with elk herds and some of our pronghorn herds. And we actually have harvest management happening with bighorn herds that we may not think about, but it's removal. And each one of these situations, there is a goal in mind. Some of them have social expectations. Many of them are ecological in terms of the environment itself has limitations. And so each is a little different. Whether it's an elk herd that is being managed for some social carrying capacity and limitations, or pronghorn herds that have physical limitations to the water availability. Each of them have a little bit different goal or objective. And so as biologists, we have to be aware of those goals, and then we have to then try to make decisions on what rate to remove animals to meet those goals, both long and short term. We pride ourselves in monitoring those population responses to those removals so that we can make adjustments down the road. Two concepts that are going to come in that I'm going to talk about is compensatory versus additive mortality. And they can be debated, but I really feel like the data that I'm going to present to you show that we actually have one of those types of mortality that does occur under certain conditions. They also have density-dependent reproduction. Tony talked about it a bit. When your populations, your females are under stress, and there's issues out there, whether it's lack of quality forage or cover. You might see, if that population's near its carrying capacity, you may see impacts to the overall productivity of those females. So I'm going to start with elk and kind of show with a series of graphs what I consider the EKG of some of these populations, some key parameters. I've picked out a few of our herds throughout the state. This is from 1982 to 2011, Central Nevada, the Table Mountain herd, if you will, in Area 16. And this slide is going to be the same slide you're going to see multiple times, so I thought I'd spend a little bit of time running over what all the data is trying to display. So on the y-axis, we have over here on the left the percent change in a value. And you can see it's from minus 20% in deficit up to 40. We have two parameters that are being displayed. They're using this axis. The first is this kind of an orange color. That is the rate of increase, the annual rate of increase of our herds. So from one year to the next, if they go from 100 to 120, it's a 20% increase. So that as long as that line is above 0, it's growing. So even though this is going down, it's growing at a lower rate. Kind of a companion line to that is, this is the population estimate line over time. And you can see for the Table Mountain elk herd, it's been growing at different rates throughout time. And you can see, for example, this rate of increase, as it dips below 0, you'll start to see a slowing or a leveling of the population growth. And then a big one that's going to come into play that I really want you to focus on is the red line. That is the percent of cow elk or female elk that were harvested of the total estimated cow elk in the herd. And this percentage rate is important to pay attention to in each of these different herds. So you can see we didn't have any harvest for a couple years, and then we started with some cow harvest because we had management goals and objectives to maintain this herd throughout the 80s and 90s. And we were down at 15% of all adult cow elk were being harvested from that herd. And as you can see over time, we made some adjustments, but we averaged about 7 to 8% of the cows being harvested every year. And even with that rate, you can see that we still were increasing the elk herd. So we were slowing it down, managing for the habitat, managing for the social carrying capacity in relation to the livestock industry concerns and demands. But keep in mind this rate, about 7 or 8% overall, but we certainly were dipping into the 15%. And the elk population's ability to grow. This is our biggest elk herd in the state, in the White Pine County area, the Shell Creeks, Egan's, Unit 111 through 115, and 221, 222. Not as heavy of a removal of the cow elk, but you can see again we were climbing at a little bit lower rate, obviously, than what this elk herd has the capability to do, with about a 5% removal of cows every year. And then starting in 2000, we started ramping up our cow elk removal and harvest, and sure enough, we started flattening out that population estimate. And then the last few years, we've actually been driving that elk herd down a bit more, again in line to its social carrying capacity. And another herd up in the northeast corner of the state, we call the Jarbidge herd, 07274. You can see early on, we had some pretty high cow elk harvest rates. 17–18% of the cows were being harvested, but yet we didn't cause that estimate to go down, but to slow down and level it off. Each herd has at a different rate of harvest to manage those numbers. And getting back a little bit to what Tony had talked about, mule deer, hopefully you all know they can twin, often do twin. Whether or not they maintain both fawns to recruitment to 1 year of age is all about a lot of issues on the landscape, predation, carrying capacity. Elk, on the other hand, rarely twin. They're just producing a single calf every year. Now they can live very long lives, 20 years. We've seen 20-year-old cows with calves, but they don't have the total productivity potential that a deer has, and as the pronghorn that I'm going to talk about. But just keep in mind the percentages that we saw that were not reducing the herd, but were maintaining the herd at a slow growth. Now let's look at some of our pronghorn herds. These two slides I didn't label. I'll just say that you can see that this herd is growing and then leveled off, and this herd is overall maintaining itself. It certainly has dropped a good number the last decade. One of these, we actually have been harvesting pronghorn does for about a decade or more, and one of the other one, we've never harvested pronghorn doe, just bucks. The actual first slide that showed a much more stronger growth was the herd in Humboldt County that we've been harvesting does for actually since 1996. And this is an important point that I talked earlier about. You know, not every animal lives, and there's a lot of people that think every time you kill a female, that's one less opportunity for us to have fawns, to survive, and to build that herd. But that's not the case, because in every natural wild population, we're somewhere between the high 80s and the mid 90s for survival rates for an animal, annual survival rates. And so there's always this leeway or this opportunity where you can have this additive or compensatory mortality, and those animals that survive from not being harvested by a certain mortality factor may show a greater survival rate than if there wasn't any harvest or that particular type of mortality rate. So in pronghorn, this was only about, in this particular herd, about a 3% harvest over the years, and up until 2007 it was growing, and we finally leveled it off. This does have a little bit of a social carrying capacity. A lot of the doe harvest we have there is in response to a lot of alfalfa field depredation. Another herd which has some very deep troughs in the graph is the 067-68 herd north of Battle Mountain. It's an area that historically not a lot of people gave it much faith to have much of a pronghorn herd. Been ravaged and devastated by wildfires over the last 20 years. It has an interstate that blocks off the migration of the pronghorn to the south in the wintertime. And we've been struggling to, and this also has a doe harvest, because their summer range is pretty productive, but when they get to winter range, they've got huge challenges. We've seen some pretty large mortality events, and so we've been trying to keep this herd at what we feel is the carrying capacity of, you know, between 1,200 to 1,300 animals, at least up until about 2008. We had some additional fires that hit it just last year. But I want to show you, again, the potential of these herds, especially with a pronghorn, the species that twins, always twins. And this red line, again, we didn't have much doe harvest or removal, but then in 2002, we were down to almost 25%, up to 25% of all does were removed. We saw this population building. We were fearful that we were going to see a nasty winter event. The winter range had not fully recovered from the wildfires, and it was probably just the year after a wildfire in 2000. This increase in harvest was not only doe harvest, but we were capturing pronghorn for source stock for reintroductions and augmentations elsewhere in the state where there was small populations. But even with the dipping down at 25% of the does, yes, we did see a decline, sharp decline, short term in the rate of increase, but because of the resiliency and the ability for those pronghorn to bounce back, both survival rate wise and likely density dependent wise for reproduction, they were right back in the saddle a couple years later and producing a lot of animals and maintaining themselves even with continued harvest. 2007, again, a huge number of pronghorn were removed because we had further loss, more winter range, and the carrying capacity had further dropped. But the ability for these animals to accommodate removal is much greater, I think, than most of us can realize. Another pronghorn herd that we've just recently started to harvest does from started in '99 at about a 6 to 7% rate, and we're seeing no signs of that herd declining. It's been maintaining itself and being pretty stable. This is, I think, what's happening in a lot more of our herds than we want to recognize, is this trend of, and this is in White Pine County, eastern White Pine County. Populations are going along. We do have a little Doe Harvest, but it's less than 1%. And then we built this population up to almost 2,000 animals. We've never seen this population since the 80s above 2,000. In fact, probably not more than 1,600. And then we hit a huge drought. If everyone remembers, eastern Nevada, 6, 7, and 8 were really dry. We saw record low fawn recruitment, and I really feel if we would have seen the long-term trends of this 14 to 1,600 population level, said, you know what, we know this population likely, if it gets above that, it's going to be subject to these catastrophic events, whether it's a wildfire, whether it's a drought, heavy winter. And like in 06-7 and 6-8, maybe we should be considering doe removal, doe harvest, to maintain it so that we don't get up to a point and then we see a sharp decline in that herd. We lost 300 animals in that first year. And it's maybe starting to level off at a lower level, but if we would have ramped up that doe harvest, slowed that population down a bit, possibly got it a little bit to track closer to its carrying capacity at the current time, we may have not seen this sharp decline. I just have a couple examples with bighorn herds, and I really wanted to focus on pronghorn today. You've heard me talk about our bighorns are as high as they've ever been in the state of Nevada. We're very proud that we're approaching 10,000 bighorns in the state of Nevada, but we have some huge challenges on the horizon. Herds that have been growing very well, but within their limited habitat, many of them are reaching their carrying capacity. And we certainly need to be cognizant of those herds. But the productivity of bighorn, they don't twin, but here's some examples of what we have for productivity that we have to pay attention to. The River Mountains between Boulder City and Lake Mead, really considered an island of bighorn surrounded by man and water and craziness, and they're still thriving. 1986, there was 240 estimated in the population, and from 86 to 2010, we've removed 436 bighorn to help fuel our ability to restore extirpated herds throughout the state. It's the most captured population in the state. And in 2011, it was at 250. And on average, we removed 17, close to 18 animals every year. And it didn't blink out. It maintained itself. And I think, again, it's some pretty interesting data to help support the idea that the ability for these herds, you cannot underestimate them to recover from removal. Mostly used, yeah, I would say probably 80% of the 70% of the removal were were ewes and not rams. Another herd recently that we've been using that came from the River Mountains historically and were transplanted and reintroduced into central Nevada to restore a herd there that was extirpated on Mount Jefferson. We captured pretty heavily from 2003 to 2008, 116, and that herd is pretty much the same population level. And that population has a lot more mortality factors than the River Mountains. Certainly, all of our major carnivores, lions, coyotes. So I want to go back to the graphs that I had shown on the pronghorn herd and tease out exactly what this compensatory mortality is all about and how it can help, or how populations respond to certain types of harvest or mortality removal. Compensatory mortality is improving survival of the remaining animals not harvested, or their ability to compensate for the loss of animals that were harvested in the overall herd that they share, in the space they share. Versus additive mortality, there is no improvement in the survival of those animals that survived and that were not harvested. And therefore, that if you had harvested animals, that in addition to those harvested animals, or excuse me, in addition to the loss of animals to non-harvest mortality, those harvested animals are in addition to. And if it's additive, certainly you can't put as much pressure or harvest as many animals as we saw like in the elk, because it's every lost animal is that many less that are around to produce more. But I'm going to show some slides that I believe that are showing that we are seeing the compensatory mortality with pronghorn. Though slight as it is, if we maintain a certain level of harvest, we're going to be very safe in that level and not impacting the herd. This graph is showing two different herds, different colors. 6'7", 6'8", we talked about, is the top line, and the bottom line is 041, 042 in Pershing County. Both sizable pronghorn herds. And this is the annual survival rates. You can see that the 041, 042 stays about a 2% lower survival rate over that 20-year period, whereas, and that experiences no female harvest, just buck harvest. Whereas the top line, as we talked, has had some pretty severe removal of pronghorn, both does and bucks, over the years. And I think that this estimated survival rate is highly likely caused by this compensatory mortality, where the population that has harvest, the remaining surviving does have a higher survival rate. Here's another comparison of a harvested herd versus a non-harvested herd. We're seeing about a 4% differential in the survival of those does that are in a herd that has no harvest of the doe segment versus a population that has doe harvest each year. I've looked specifically into our computer models that hopefully many of you have seen, you commissioners and the sportsmen in the audience. They're pretty detailed population models that take into account all the data we collect in the field and our best estimates of other parameters that we don't collect data on. And in our population model, we have each age cohort, each age class that we track over time, and their survival, their recruitment of fawns from each age class. And so this is that 067, 68 herd that we've done a fair amount of doe harvest and removing does for capture. So in August 05, if you tally up all the age classes from yearlings to 10 years old, and that's what our model goes to, and then it cuts off and doesn't allow any animals older than 10 in the model. There were 734 total adult female does in the population. This particular year we had 29 does that were harvested by sportsmen, and they were proportionally removed from the age class as they make up the total of that doe herd, doe segment. We take into account wounding loss spread across the age classes. And then in addition to this, and this is important, is this non-hunting mortality from disease to predation, exposure to whatever. So from August to February, we had that harvest, wounding loss, and non-mortality loss, or non-hunting loss. So that by February of 2006, we're now down to 675 total does. And then in the model, we account for the other part of the year from February to August. And again, the non-hunting mortality was 23. And this coincides with about a 94% survival, annual survival for those does. So we're removing 6% of those does annually on top of the harvest, the hunting. And so by August of 2006, a couple things have happened. Each of one of these animals is 1 year older. They had a birthday. So this 133 are the fawns from the previous year. They're now the yearlings. And with that productivity added to the herd, that happens every year, in the new age, the 10-year-olds being dropped out of the population, we have 762. So with the harvest, with the natural mortality, we actually increase the herd, the adult does, with the harvest. This is what I think would be a likely scenario if we didn't have harvest for the same herd. Again, we start with the same number of animals. We don't have the harvest or hunting going on, so we have the non-hunting mortality, and if we were to predict a 2% reduction in the survival rate of these animals, we would have increased at some point in time over those 6 months that we'd really have 37 does die naturally. Then by February we've got close to 700. We're going to lose some more throughout the remainder of the year, and then by August of the following year we could be somewhere in that 770 range. And so if you were to compare that to the harvested herd, they're very similar. Yeah, we might have a few more with non-harvest, but the bottom line is both herds are growing, one's with harvest and one without harvest. They're both growing. And I think that's because of the compensatory mortality that we're detecting from our data. So thinking about the ability for these pronghorn herds to maintain themselves with this additional harvest, give a little bit of background on where we're at currently with our herds. So right now, last year's estimate was 27,000 statewide. Record numbers. It's the highest we've ever documented. But several of these herds, we really feel are approaching their current carrying capacity. And this is based on not only the performance of these herds. You saw some of those graphs where our biologists are seeing these herds leveling out. We're doing nothing different out there. Same predators have been out there forever. We're not harvesting any, we're not removing any, and they seem to be slowly slowing down their growth and looking like they're reaching some level in sync with their habitat. On top of that, our guys, our biologists are very cognizant of the water distribution in many of these herds, water being very limited in many of our pronghorn herds in central and southern Nevada. And we're fearful of too many animals using these limited water sources in the heat of the summer. Other herds in northern Nevada, they're just one ignition away from a catastrophic fire that could eliminate some key foraging areas and fawning areas in the short term. And if we allow these herds to overgrow their carrying capacity, we might see some huge losses. Last year we had 1,300 hunters apply for Doe pronghorn tags. There's a 5-to-1 draw odds. So there was pretty high demand from hunters for going Doe pronghorn, or shorter than the ears antelope hunting. And so I'm suggesting by applying a 3 to 5% harvest rate to the doe segment of these herds that are near or at their carrying capacity or have these major challenges on the horizon, that we can better manage these herds, reduce major declines from these catastrophic events, and provide substantial hunting opportunities where we've got expressed demand from our hunting publics. That's it. Certainly would love to have any questions you may have.
Mr. Rain.
Thank you. Might as well come off with a couple things here. Notice our talking about population goals. I so we see them significantly here about elk, largely due to social reasons, and there's other reasons presented, and those are quite reasonable. Some population production goals also came up within pronghorn. It seems mostly where agriculture is involved. Come up with some basic goals because they have some limits to where we need to have. In the bighorn, I noticed you come up with goals in some areas where they're at carrying capacity, which basically is a form of production goal. It could be seen roughly like that. But deer. Now I come back to deer. Okay, you've likely recognized that much of the criticism and questions from the commission past concentrated away from areas and species with production goals or some sort of a population goal. And I go back to, on the mule deer issue, go back to what's currently the suspended commission policy number 288. I believe that's how it would be designated. The number one issue driving that, and then item number one, which it was, Department of Wildlife shall actively pursue enhancing game populations by setting and reaching game production goals. And if many of the other points beyond that referred back to those particular goals. So why don't we have, or working towards, or maybe are working towards, game production goals for mule deer? Thank you. That's my question.
Maybe have Tony help with that, but I certainly was more focused on pronghorn
I know, but
today.
We can go in a lot of different directions with that question. I guess I would ask that is that an acknowledgement that carrying capacity is a factor for deer? Is there an upper limit to that production? Would harvest strategies recommended to the commission to meet that production goal be a welcome and supported idea? I don't think that we look at mule deer at 110,000, and we look at bighorn sheep at highest numbers we've ever had that are still one-fifth that. We look at pronghorn that are highest numbers that we've ever had, roughly a quarter of that. I've got some philosophical views on population objectives. They require a great deal of coordination and cooperation with our federal land management partners, especially with respect to the sorts of disturbance regimes that would be required to significantly increase mule deer populations. One of the things that mule deer as a specialist browser, not like a grazer like we see with elk and pronghorn that are benefiting from a lot of these type conversion events, wildfire. Mule deer as a specialist grazer. They have a highly specialized dietary niche that varies a lot with weather conditions. So as we see droughts come and wet periods come and go, we see that carrying capacity increase and decrease. Carrying capacity isn't a fixed value. So part of the dilemma is if you set a number for a population objective and that carrying capacity decreases, let's say that we put a hypothetical number on each management unit for a goal. Now if we're in a drought situation and we're unable to meet that goal, we're in failure. If we have an El Nino effect, we get incredible precipitation, and all of a sudden we have twice the numbers out there as our goal. Are we going to go in there and remove does, or do we have a lot of sustainable opportunity that we can continue to utilize? I think that not only the numbers, but the distribution, the coordination and cooperation required by federal land management agencies, and the variability of carrying capacity makes it arguably unrealistic to have a herd objective goal for mule deer. And I don't think that we would necessarily have them for elk if it wasn't for the social or political environment. I think the reason why we have them for sheep is we have limited habitats for sheep. We're concerned about disease events, density-dependent events, overlap with domestic livestock issues where you reach a density and animals will wander and you have disease issues. So I think there's other factors driving those objectives on the other populations as well.
So the question to me was about carrying capacity, and what would I'm trying to remember that. It was about carrying capacity. Would it be welcomed if we was based upon, and would it be recognized for carrying capacity? And well, I think of course, but that's one thing I've kept asking is where's the data on the carrying capacity? If you got some data on carrying capacity saying, unit, pick one, has carrying capacity of,
So let's take Simpson Park. So let's look at our
Simpson Park Mountains. If you have carrying capacity of this, states we should have the population maximum of this much for this year. And of course, we have these meetings every year, so of course that's why we come back every year. I mean, I think everybody understands the moving target because otherwise we'd set one for. We wouldn't come back and set quotas for one every year. We'd set them for 20 years in advance, right? We come back every year because things change. So, but if you came back to Simpson Park, for example, and you came back and said, well, I think we should have 1,000 or 20,000 deer this year right now, and therefore, we think we have approximately this many, and therefore we should probably harvest this. Hey, that's the whole point, I believe, of what we were talking about before in what, mule deer should be done in mule deer management. Let's come up with some goals. Of course they'll change. That's next year. Of course we'll have a fire, we'll have a flood, we'll have great feed, and there'll be more. But we need to come up with something to know whether or not we're succeeding rather than, gee, we got a bunch of deer and there's a bunch less and a bunch more, and is that good or bad? If we don't have goals, how will we know we're doing good? How will we know what to push for? How will we know that we need to try to increase the population in the Simpson parks? If we think we're at, how do we know that we don't have too many already?
Our constituents are pretty good at reminding us.
Well, and but if you notice, that's where the criticism comes in the areas where we don't have goals. So my number one thing, if you notice, that's why it was number one on the mule deer thing when it came up was, let's get some goals. Right, wrong, or otherwise, of course, they'll be changing from year to year, and new factors come in, the new study, the new whatever. But at least we'll have something to base, call it success upon. These are our goals. Let's try to get to them. We'll have something to work towards. And the elk, I see that's one. I mean, that's. Have you ever seen arguments from me about the elk? Basically, no. Should we have it 1 month to the next? But we don't argue. You don't get arguments from the total quotas. Basically, if it is, it's over 6 or 10 elk. The deer, that's a whole other thing. I don't see those.
Well, I think another part of the problem with the deer is taking all-time population highs and setting them as realistic, achievable, everyday goals. You know, you can't. Again, you're looking at population numbers. We're looking at absolute numbers and saying, well, we published a population estimate of 240 in 1988. Therefore, that's a realistic goal to be there every day, all day, every day, and that simply isn't.
Which I don't think anybody ever said. It wasn't written in the policy.
Would you, for example, the Simpson Parks, the data that Tony showed today, that it looks like it's had tremendous growth, but based on some parameters that we've been collecting on that herd, would you support if we said certainly right now as it stands, no change in the habitat, that herd could be at carrying capacity? Would you support some doe removals?
If we, I mean, you have to look at the data, and if that was the conclusion, and you did that in a area by area, that's when you would do that. Absolutely. If you came up with some data with saying, hey, the carrying capacity, I mean, don't think anybody's unreasonable. If you can say, we think the carrying capacity is this, right, wrong, or otherwise, this is what we think it is, based upon what you'll base it upon. Then, of course, then, you know, that will be at least reasonable. At least we'll know where we're at. You know, hey, this is the why, because we think carrying capacity is this. That's reasonable. But if we just go out there and we want to kill them because we think they're at carrying capacity, and why do we think that? Why? And that's, of course, it's the hardest thing to measure, and of course, it's a moving target. But at least let's get a goal out there. You know, we think that now it can probably support 2,000 deer. Maybe he thinks it should be 2,500, and he thinks it should be 200. Well, let's find the right number. Let's come up with a number, any number, and let's work towards that number. And based upon the best information we can. But yeah, of course I'd support that if it was based upon something. You only do what you can do, based upon the best information you can get.
Any other questions for Mike or Tony?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a comment. You guys know that I have been an advocate for talking carrying capacity for a long time. So I welcome the discussion. And I look forward to getting into it and figuring out a way to get it incorporated into these plans. And it is a moving target. It changes. And I think that the discussion's progressed a long way since we talked about it 10 years ago. I can tell you that. And I'm really glad that we're getting into that. I think it's the key. Tony, your presentations on the mule deer bulletin stuff, I think that the carrying capacity can't be overstated as how important a cog in that whole wheel that it is. I mean, it sets the stage for everything. So I welcome it.
Okay. No other comment from the commissioners?
Just one real quick. Tony, in your presentation, you said that the ruby herd was the heaviest deer when you were putting the collars on them, right?
Not necessarily the heaviest, but we did see an increase in body weights from last year to this year in the rubies.
Yeah.
They were in better shape this year.
Which would mean that probably the carrying capacity is a little more there.
It would suggest that there's been a positive response in the deer, likely as a result of increased nutritional quality or forage abundance, correct?
Yeah.
So as a result of that and a mild winter, I would be hopeful that we would see an increase in our production and recruitment next year as a result of that.
So that would be going along with what Scott was saying, that you would probably increase the goal there then.
Yeah, I guess you know, I would submit that it is so variable, and simply by having that goal, I would ask if that would change our management strategies or goals. And we manage mule deer with the idea of maximizing everything all the time. And we have plenty of policies and goals on other species that we either fail to meet or fail to comply with due to social reasons. And I would hate to see us so bogged down in a carrying capacity estimation exercise that we're unable to actually meet the needs of the species on the ground.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you guys. Appreciate it. Okay, so the